National Express. When your life's in a mess, it'll make you smile. All human life is here, from the feeble old deer to the screaming child, from the student who knows that to have one of those would be suicide, to the family man manhandling the pram with paternal pride.
We get red deer.
Jemima.
Hundreds of them. And if you go to the
Get the sticky weed off me.
Oh, you haven't got any sticky weed on you, Sheila.
Yes, I have.
there's a whole lot growing there in that corner.
Are you a
There was
farmer?
some book.
You're a farmer?
Yes, the farmer's so decent. I just feel with the way things are going, it'd be good the more home food you can
I've
grow,
seen
the
on your
better.
Instagram, you and Marianne dropping the potatoes in the
Well,
vehicle. It was gorgeous.
who is it, my daughter? That was Ruth. Yeah, they was planting them.
Ruth.
She
Yes.
was on the tractor.
It was, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
it was so
It's
lovely.
just up here too, but
Felicity looks funny.
Georgie gave Callum a hat to wear. Welcome to One of Nine. I'm Maria Jones and I'm really excited to meet today Marianne and Callum McFarlane-Barrow,
that's right.
who many of our viewers will know or have heard of. I have heard of you for many years, almost feel quite starstruck meeting this gorgeous couple. We are here in Scotland and we've driven past such gorgeous sights that it took us a little bit longer to get here than we thought because we just had to keep stopping. It's absolutely stunning up here. You've got slightly English accents. For what I expected when I first spoke to Marianne, I thought, oh, we have a very elegant English accent. So you are Scottish somehow? What's your heritage?
Well, I'm actually more Scottish than Callum is, the truth be told. But my mother was a Bruce and a Macaulay on both sides, so she was a thoroughbred Scot, and but my father was English. But we spent most of our young days abroad. I was born in Cyprus, so I suppose I've grown up with people who speak English and not that. People always think I'm English, but actually I've got a lot of Scottish blood in me.
I'm a mixture. My father was brought up in Derbyshire. A lot of interesting tales about it. In his family, before they came from Yorkshire, the Barrow part, lots of them were clerical people, even one or two bishops in the family going right the way back, Anglican.
Aha.
They ended up owning this steel works, a big forge, and they, interestingly enough, had the biggest lathe, steel lathe in the whole of the UK at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution.
Mimi.
They turned these huge big discs on it, and you can still see them to this day in the tubes in London. Some of the tubes in London, they were actually made on this lathe in Derbyshire. Anyway, one brother who was very, very clever, he really was a genius. He could, most of us can add up a single row of figures like 9, 3, 7, you get
Just
the
about.
answer. Perhaps 2 is more difficult, like 29, 38, so on. That's really hard, but he could go up a page with his fingers like that and he'd have the total at the top. And he got involved in the railway business. and his brother, who is my great grandfather approximately, he went out to Spain. He went to Bilbao, and he became the vice consul in Bilbao. And he married a Spanish girl. After he was there, it was quite interesting. He went back to his brother, now still in Staveley Works in Derbyshire, saying, "You wouldn't believe it. Nearly all the people out here are in bare feet, or wearing bare feet, you know." And this clever brother at home said, "That's an interesting one." So he began getting shoes, and he had boatloads of shoes, filling up great big boats in the docks in Liverpool. And he sent out a boatload of shoes all the way out to and he was making a fortune out of it. And the wretched government got onto him. And they said, they slapped this massive tax on every pair of shoes. The tax will be so much, which made it hardly viable. So anyway, he was so clever. You know what he did? He sent out a whole boatload of right foot shoes. 3 months later, he sent out a boat of left foot shoes, which would match up. And they got round it because the tax was on a pair of shoes.
Oh, that's so funny.
So he
Good
got
lad.
round that one. Coming down the way, his father, he went around Europe and he spent all the money that he'd been made in this.
Your grandfather?
Yes, my grandfather. He spent most of the money, so there wasn't very much money left at the end of it. My father became a minister. His mother, my grandmother, was a Macfarlane, whose father was down in Derbyshire, and he was a minister, a Presbyterian minister in Derbyshire, Episcopalian, I think. Anyway, my father came north, and he wanted to become a minister, and we got to know the Highlands. He just loved the Highlands. He loved everything Highland. He went mad about the Highlands. He learned to play the pipes. He's a good linguist. He learned Gaelic fluently.
Wow.
And then he became a minister, and he preached in Inverary, where Joe's got the painting of.
Oh, I see.
Yes,
You have
that part of where
painting
that church
on-
in the back. And my father was the vicar of Inverary for a while. But he became an Episcopalian. But in 1928, he kept looking over his shoulder at the Catholic Church, and he read, and he began putting two together, and he began studying it. And he's naturally a good theologian. He delved into it more and more and more, and until he realized he had to embrace the Catholic faith, which he did in 1928. It would have been. He was born in 1880. My father. So that's back a little bit, isn't it? From now.
Wow.
2022. He was born in
The
1880.
Victorian era.
So at the age of
Cole's the youngest of a big family, so he was the baby of how many? Seven?
six, my family, and I'm number 6 here. But anyway, so my father became a Catholic, and he did a lot. He gave a lecture in Glasgow. He was asked to give a lecture. It was entitled "Why I Became a Catholic." He made a lovely remark in it. He said, "What I've bestowed to my wife and to my children wouldn't compare what a millionaire might be able to leave to his children, you know." Because my father had tremendous courage to do what he did in becoming a Catholic, especially at that time.
Yeah.
In this area, you know, Catholics were just out completely, you know. And unlike perhaps today, sadly, he'd look over his shoulder and he'd see the unity within the Catholic Church. Wherever it was all around the world, everything was the same, you know. And this really made it impinge on it. It hadn't got this diversity. And there was also, he knew one minister could be saying something doctrinally which could be contradicted by another minister further down the road. And he said, "There's something wrong. They can't both be right." actually I put in barley. I think we make it to beer.
Right, amazing.
Like a whiskey.
So then you met in Scotland. You were living in Scotland and met
I met Marion up in Inverness.
in Inverness.
In Inverness.
Yes, he worked and lived in Inverness, or in this area, not particularly this area, but on the west coast for most of his life. Whereas I came up when I was 9 to Inverness, and then went to school in Aberdeen, and then went down to London and came back up and met Cullum in Inverness, because we both were part of the same parish. So that's how we met.
And so you were a physiotherapist in London.
That's right.
And then did you continue that in Scotland?
I did for a very short time. Yes, I came up to work as a physiotherapist in the hospital in Inverness, and then with the idea of going to Hong Kong. Can't imagine why I wanted to go to Hong Kong, but I did, and met Cullum and never went to Hong Kong. It's been a year really of meeting Cullum. We got married and went over to live in Royal Deeside, well, Braemar, which is the highest village in Britain, I think. In Tomintoul and Braemar. So we were there for 10 years.
Helen, you were working on an estate.
Yes,
Big
a big
estate, yeah.
estate there.
It was it was 63,000 acres.
63,000?
63,000 acres, the estate. There's nearly all mountains. There's only one little arable. The arable on the whole estate amounted to about 80 acres.
So how did you
All the rest was
deal
deer
with it?
forest.
So did you have to patrol? Did you sometimes go and check?
Oh
the
yeah,
things?
yeah, very much so. We all had Land Rovers. There were keepers. We all were stalkers. So we had to stalk the deer, and to make enough income, we'd have to get in paying clients. So they're mainly from abroad. One or two English, but mainly foreign.
That were buying the deer.
Yes, they were paying the money to shoot the deer. We kept the deer. You keep the trophy if they were good, you know. But we kept the meat. But we charged them. They had to pay a fee to have the right to shoot so many deer in a week. And they had to shoot the deer because if we didn't, they'd die of starvation. So it's actually a mercy to them.
It's going on now.
It's sort of like a farmer can't let the lambs flourish and increase and increase. The whole farm would be overgrazed. So it's all the same with deer. They have to be culled
Yeah.
to keep a good healthy stock. About 3,000 deer on the estate.
So the famous River Dee, which actually had its source on the estate, but we had the fishing on the estate as well. So people would come for the famous salmon fishing on the Royal Dee, which was very prestigious. You know, the whole place was owned by a couple of brothers who were Anglo-Swiss, and they didn't live there. So for 90% of the year, the bosses, as it were living in Switzerland, and so we lived a very, very isolated life. But there were pockets of Catholicism there that had remained. So there was a little church in the village and a little Catholic school, which only had, I think it was 16 kids when our eldest Ruth went to begin with. But when we left at the end of our 10 years, they closed the school because there was 4 of our children. By that time, there was only about 9 children left in the school. So they closed the school. And secondary schooling was a big problem, and that because it was miles away and they had to board. And that was one of the many reasons why we left there.
You married and met and got married quite quickly.
Yeah, we did.
Romance.
Yeah, very much.
Was it a far cry then from what it is now? Was it different?
What, romance?
Yes.
Yes,
Were you
I
stalked?
certainly. Darling, there's telephones. I always think when I'm talking to young people nowadays that I suppose they're very much more prudent or very much more fearful of commitment than we were in those days. And perhaps we were rash, I don't know. But in those days, if you loved somebody, you immediately thought you were going to get married and that was it for life as far as I was concerned. But nowadays, young people go through agony of discernment. Will I, won't I, is it God's will, is it not God's will? And it can go on for years. But I'm afraid to say, all my big decisions in life, I said a prayer, but I wasn't going to take years to decide. It's like when we adopted the children. It wasn't a decision that took me ages to make my mind up. I just think this is from God. In fact, I really had decided that I would marry Callum within about 2 or 3 days of meeting him. I decided he was the man I was going to marry. I don't know, it took him a bit longer than me, but I certainly had made up my mind to the extent that when I went down for one of my brother's children's baptism in London a few weeks after I'd met him, to my mother's absolute horror, I took my money, which I'd carefully saved to go to Hong Kong, out of the bank and went and spent it all in liberties on material for my wedding dress
Gorgeous.
and the pattern, and brought it back home because there was nothing like that in Inverness. And I was determined, well, I better make the most of this. I'm in London, so I might as well get my wedding dress organised.
Did you go for white or a different colour?
It was a beautiful satin, a sort of ivory-coloured satin. Yeah, it was very beautiful.
And you
yeah.
made it?
No, Mum actually got it made for me, so that was lovely. But
And women now might say there's not enough
I know.
good men, blah,
I
blah,
know,
blah.
I know.
Was Callum a rose among thorns, or were there many great fellows?
No, anybody, no, not as far as I was concerned. I had one other love in my life, and I left because in London with a broken heart because he didn't even believe in God. He was somebody whom I immediately thought I could marry, and he was, obviously, I met him in church, and he came from a family that the faith meant a lot to, and came from a big family, seemed to fit the bill to me, and looked very handsome, wore the kilt all the time in those days. So, for better or for worse, I made the decision there and then, I think. You know. As I say, it took a bit longer for Callum, but he
Yeah, I'm more
wasn't.
canny.
Callum loves his options open. It's really, really difficult for young people to marry a Catholic. You know, I know Inverness wasn't, you know, this is far more remote than Inverness was, but I mean, the number of Catholics per head, you know, per population is very, very low. So to marry a Catholic and meet a Catholic that you really want to marry is really a miracle, you know, and so that's why I
Well,
rejoice
today,
when
it's
I
like
see
everybody,
my
isn't it?
grandchildren marrying Catholics, because that's just the greatest gift, I think. And I think nowadays, I think it's always been difficult to be married to a non-Catholic, but I think nowadays with the culture the way it is, to marry a non-Catholic is really difficult. And two of
The
my
boundaries have been pushed further and further.
more and more difficult.
Yeah.
Not perhaps for your own faith, although I think it would have eventually eroded. It wouldn't grow in the same way, but I think for your children's sake and your grandchildren's sake, when I look around, it's mixed marriages that have the most difficulty in keeping the faith for their children, with their children. I think it just makes life so much more complicated and difficult. I think we're all blessed if we have a husband or a wife that you never for one split second ever think for 1 minute that that person is being unfaithful or would leave you. I can't imagine being married to somebody where that would ever enter your head, and yet, unfortunately, it seems to be prevalent in so many people's lives, and I think that's the greatest gift that God can give you, really, that feeling of total security and love, you know. If you don't have that, well, that's the biggest gift that God can give you, you know, other than your faith. But if you're going to be a married person, to have that gift, I think, is just unbelievable, yeah.
You then started having little ones up there.
Yes, we had Ruth within a year of our being married. And then we seemed to hit a time when we didn't. It was 2 and a bit years before. Well, it was longer than that before we had another child, which is Magnus ourselves. But careful, yes, I hate those ones for little ones. They tip over very easily.
Would you want to come and sit with Mama?
If she sits still, sorry.
She wants to hear more about liberties and what you can get her in.
Oh, do you where's your hat, darling?
I want to hold her for.
Oh, sweet. Oh. Hey, oh, and good, both in between the stripes. Down now, and then you'll be all matching. Oh, a little bridge.
We got married in 62. Ruth was born in 63, and we
Hope for another, which didn't come.
Yeah, we didn't have another one for some time, and then we decided that there was a big need at the time for would-be adopters because there were so many Irish. It was before the abortion bill came, and there were masses of Irish girls coming over to Scotland, having their babies and leaving them there for adoption. And so there was an appeal in the parishes, I think, but certainly it was well known that there were a lot of babies that didn't have homes. And so we went ahead and adopted our first boy, Seamus, 6 weeks old. And then they actually rang us when Seamus was a few months old and said, I know it seems very odd, but would you by any chance be able to take another one? We've got so many babies without mama. So they offered us twins or a baby boy, and I said, look, we'll pray about it. So we prayed about it. So we rang them up and said, right, we'll take the twins if you haven't got anywhere for the twins to go. Otherwise, we'll have the little boy. So they said, oh, don't worry, a couple have come about, and they've taken their third set of twins from us. And so we've still got this little boy, though. So we took Fergus. And that's one of the greatest gifts. Yes, again, 6 weeks old. I think he was a week older because his mother was distraught about giving him up. So we took those two boys, and then no sooner had we had Fergus, a few weeks later we discovered I was pregnant with Magnus. So we had the 3 boys very, very close to each other. So that was a family of 4. So by the time we left Braemar in, 10 years, 72, to rent a hotel in Glencoe, at the bottom of Glencoe, we had four little ones. So that was us, and we did 5 horrible years in this hotel. Callum loved it. But if we hadn't done that slog, because by the time we left, he loved every minute of it. I loathed it.
So funny.
Poor man doing all the cooking and all the hassles
cooking,
of staff and everything.
But
It
Callum,
was all God's plan. It was amazing. I mean, we made money there. We made nothing when we were living in Braemar. You were so mean, our employers. They were on a minimum wage, really, you know.
everything was the system, and it still happens in Scotland, I'm sure, to a certain extent, in farms and things down south, is we were, even Callum's, everything was tied. So the house we lived in, we had a lovely little cottage. This is in Braemar. We had 2 cars. We had, a Land Rover and a car. Callum had a new kilt every year, new kilt stockings, all given, but then £12 a week. So we had £12 a week cash, 4 children, but everything else was free. And he expected to live on fresh air, because, so when we left there, we virtually had, by the time we bought a car to move, we virtually had nothing left at all. So we rented the hotel to begin with, and it was really hard work. And we ended up, by 3 or 4 years later, being able to buy the hotels. So by the time we'd done our 5 years, we'd upped the hotel. Callum had built the old farm buildings outside. He'd converted into a huge restaurant. So we had the restaurant as well as the hotel and all the rest of it. And yet another bar. And so after 5 years, we sold it. And it was only because of that we could have bought this. The lodge. This house didn't exist then. So it was all in God's
He wanted
plan.
us to
We'd
get this
never
place,
been
and he
able
knew
to
he
do
couldn't
that.
get it unless we had the money. So he allowed us to go through this awful ordeal.
The desert.
But they were just for one reason, to get enough money to be able to buy this place and then give it to him.
So you saw this. What attracted you to moving here?
We looked and looked and looked. The criterion was, as far as I was concerned, we were looking for get out of the hotel. We didn't want anything to do with the license, with the alcoholic license, somewhere in the middle of nowhere, preferably, and somewhere where we could do a B&B or dinner, bed and breakfast, you know, a small unlicensed hotel, really. And we looked at a lot of places which were, you know, miles and miles away from anywhere. And it was my sister who really twisted our arm to get this. It hadn't been ever lived in as a family home, never lived in all the year round by anybody. It had always been a hunting lodge, which the people from the south, was part of a huge estate. The Bedorbans who owned it originally, as White Dove, they just came up from London for the season and would arrive with their coaches and things and do the fishing and the shooting. Because with the house came quite a bit of salmon fishing down here. So it was really a repeat of our old life, because there was also a lease on the hill at the back here for another 10 years, was it? So
There was a sign to the house.
yeah.
Whoever bought the house automatically would get this assignation of the land that went with it, just for sporting rights.
Yeah.
That just suited me ideally, you know. So I was right back into if I had been before. I even got some of my Norwegian guests,
Yes.
other
some
guests
contact.
from the
Yes.
continent who came here to start hunting.
Yeah.
It was just great, you know.
Good.
It was
So
great.
on a personal level, after we got here, it was really, really hard work, because we only just had enough money. We got it very, very cheaply, and looking back, we discovered within the first week or two of being here that it had dry rot in it. And in those days, dry rot was really bad. I remember being on the phone to Mum, crying, saying, "Oh, Mum, that's it. We've had it now. There's a huge amount of dry rot in one of the attics, and we haven't got a penny to do it." And they were just, you know, they were telling us that it was going to cost us £30,000 to put it right, and we were needing to start trading straight away. But God was good, because we eventually got the money from managed to persuade the local bank to give us a permission to get a 20-year guarantee from a local person who did it for a quarter of the price. But we couldn't open that year because the whole of the roof of half of the lodge had to come down. But we spent that first summer, it was like this every day, swimming in the river with the kids. And after
Just
the
about
5
half
years
a
we
mile
had,
from here in the river,
lovely, yeah.
there's the most beautiful pool with a sandy beach.
Yeah.
And a bit slightly up from where it's deep enough to dive, so the kids have a whale of a
We
time
had a
there.
wonderful summer.
It was a really special.
Yeah.
So God gave us a great break
Yeah.
from the hard hotel work.
Yeah,
Let us buy this place, have a nice relaxing holiday before the work really began.
And that's a great way of looking at it now in hindsight. 'Cause
Yes,
at the
exactly.
time,
The other thing is, if the dry rot had been found by our surveyors, we would never have bought it. The first guests we ever had were a lord and lady, well, but I shouldn't say their name, but anyway, the first guests that ever came said, "Wow, didn't you, were so jealous that we wanted to buy this place. Did your surveyor not find the huge mushroom in the attic?" And I said, "Well, your surveyors were better than ours. Ours didn't, but thank God they didn't." and the result is that the man selling it was really giving it to us at a really good price, with 7 miles of fishing, 7 miles of salmon fishing, which in those days was quite famous fishing. And when it's interesting, you know, when we look back on the way God dealt with us, is that we then traded for 12 years as and I had my mum and dad getting older and living with us now. They both died here when they were with us. And we also adopted Mark within a few years of coming here, which was quite a different situation from the other 2 boys, because we decided that really in thanksgiving for all that God had done in our lives, this time we were going to adopt. Well, it was almost impossible to get a baby. We didn't want a baby. We took this handicapped child on who was being born with this terrible, terrible, unknown skin disease.
What age
Which
was he?
he was 7.5 and had been in care since he was a few weeks old. I came from a very abusive family and had been very badly fostered and had terrible experiences in his foster care. What they hadn't really made very clear to us was that although he was very badly affected by the skin disease when we got him, it was basically just on his
Audrey?
palms of his hands.
Audrey, come.
But he had no hair and would never have any hair, and he had it had affected all the inside, all the coverings of his inside organs were also affected, and nobody really knew what it was all about. And they reckon that perhaps his poor mother must have taken something when she was pregnant, and it had affected him in utero. So There was
Could he
very.
speak?
We tried. Oh, he
And
could speak.
was he mobile?
Highly intelligent.
Oh.
He went to university in the end, but had to leave. He was just constantly bullied because he looked a freak. You know, he had no hair and he had no teeth, as I say. The worst thing, he smelt terribly. His skin was rotting. All the surface of his skin, hands and everything were black, because they just absorbed everything, and then they had huge fissures in them. And when I got him, he was supposed to have it scrubbed every day with a metal brush, which we very quickly stopped doing. But that's what he had been put up with all his life. So we took him from one doctor to the other. He went down to Leicester Square to the big skin hospital, there for months on end. But nobody could really do very much for him. So at the end of his days, he was living on huge doses of morphine. Because it was not, by that time it was spreading and spreading and spreading, and they were talking about amputating his legs. It was getting so bad. But I mean, he lived, and there was no reason for him to die at that stage, although he was in huge pain. But he lived till he was 39, and his anniversary, I was just thinking today, it's 4th of August when he died. He went out to, he loved Magnus. I think I told you this, he just loved Magnus. Who was the nearest in age to him.
Was he a big brother at the time? Because
Yes,
Mark
his
was
big brother,
7.
Magnus, Magnus was 14, I think, when he came. And so there was that 7-year difference in him. And Magnus had a hard time because Mark was no angel when he came. And he'd been in care all his life, so his language was unbelievable. And his behaviour was equally unbelievable. He would try and break all the barriers, you know, try and see how far he could go, you know. So it took a lot of management, took a lot out of us for those first 2 years. And Magnus was the one who was still going to high school, had to go to school with him, you know, when he was behaving as badly as he did. So he really felt the brunt of it. But at the same time, he would say that it was the best thing that we'd ever done as a family. And it was with Magnus that he died, because he died when he was in Medjugorje. Magnus and he had gone out for the festival in August. Magnus always goes out, yes. Mag's going again this year. Usually Mag has to go and give a talk for Mary's Meals out there. He came to us at that stage, and then Ruth came into the kitchen one day when she was just about to go up to university, so she would have been 17. She came in and
She'd been 19, yeah.
she'd read just a little snippet, 2 lines in I think it was a Scotsman, and it said, it's rumoured that the Mother of God has appeared to, this is a complete secular paper, the Mother of God has appeared to teenagers in Yugoslavia. It was Yugoslavia in those days. And she came through to the kitchen and she said, Mum,
telling people to turn back to God.
I don't think it even said that.
They did, yeah.
But anyway, she said, if that's happening now to children of my age, she said, I want to go. But of course, communists were still very much in charge there. And that, this we're talking about 83.
1983.
Yeah. So she decided that she was going, come what may. And I just thought, well, that's a nice dream, darling.
She'd heard the visionaries were...
And then my brother's a priest out in Taiwan, and it was he who actually, because there was nothing, nobody knew the word Medjugorje, and there was nothing on a map that marked Medjugorje. So it was my brother in Taiwan who found the first little printout about the basic story of Medjugorje, and just said that it was 15 kilometres from Mostar, so we could find the word Mostar on the map. And from then onwards, they just were very serious about it. But the interesting thing, as far as we were concerned, it wasn't easy. Hello? The wind.
Come with the wind.
Yeah.
Come in, Mr. Wind. Sorry.
They haven't got an embassy. They've got what's the next thing down? The Yugoslavian, not a council. Anyway, got in touch with us and said we were very, very irresponsible parents if we allowed our children to go to Yugoslavia, to Dubrovnik. They were flying to Dubrovnik. Why were they going? And I said, well, they were going to go. I don't think I mentioned they were going to Medjugorje because we knew it was a dirty word to the communist government, you know. Anyway, I said, what's the worst that could happen to them if they go? And they said, oh, they won't get any further than Dubrovnik. They'll be deported when they get to Dubrovnik airport. So I relayed this all to the kids, who got terribly excited and decided that this is what they wanted to do. They were going to be a martyr. So after a lot of discussion, and it took them a lot of time to organise it, they had no money, but they went down a lot of adventures. But one adventure's worth retelling after Ken, Ruth's husband now, they were just going up to university, and they weren't married. They were just they'd known each other for years and years and years. And he was always out helping Callum to stalk. And when you go stalking, you have a big knife in your pocket to do what they call a gralloch. When you've shot the deer, you open them up and take all the innards out, you know. And he'd been on the hill with Callum 2-3 days before, and had still had his knife in his pocket, and so some of the bullets left over from the rifle in his pocket. And so when he went through the airport thing at Dubrovnik, he was stopped by all these. In those days, the communists, they had guns and all these things stopping him, and he was taken off to some building. And of course, Ruth thought, well, now we've had it. What's going on? They didn't know why on earth he'd been taken away. And then they saw him through this glass window, pretending to be a stag, trying to, because none of them spoke English, trying to explain to them that he was
all
a
the
stag.
soldiers, when the policemen went absolutely, they thought they had a madman on their hands.
Anyway, they took the knife and the bullets, but they let him go through, so that was their introduction. So they had that 1 week in Medjugorje, and we couldn't, there was no mobile phones or anything in those days. We knew nothing of what was going on. So they sent us, they couldn't send us anything. So we did they eventually got back, thank God, and told us, but the effect that 1 week had on them as kids. I mean, Magnus was 15, 16.
Yeah,
he was
16.
the youngest in the group. It was all, I know.
We were either that or we were blind or we were mad. God blanks, certainly blanked my mind
Yes.
at the very beginning of the whole Medjugorje thing. Because, but anyway, it's when they came back, and this is really interesting, what really touched me, it touched us both. Because being in rather a dead parish, and my face was getting pretty flat, you know. And then our children came back, and they said, you know, you ought to be praying more. This is teenagers telling their parents what to do, you know. We say, oh, yeah. Yes, and you ought to be fasting. Okay, give it a break. And they really meant it. And they've never lost that grace.
Yeah,
they've never lost that zeal in all that time.
They used to get fast on the
An
Wednesday and
incredible
Friday,
grace
and
they
then
were
have a
given, a
huge
massive
fire
grace.
just after midnight, and you could smell it in the lodge. We were living in the lodge at that time, of eggs and bacon being cooked at about 12:30 at night, and then they'd
We'd be
tuck into it,
fasting
and they
all
were
day,
really
you know,
serious about it. And then, of course, they begged us to go, and that's when we have a couple of. That's your babe.
Ruby's going. Ruby, have you got the baba?
We were given this grace, but quite undoubtedly, to do something about it. And because it's the type of business we have, most of our trade was in the summertime. The winter we were quieter. So in the wintertime we decided to invite people who were now interested in Medjugorje, basically from the Glasgow area and round about, to come up here for a weekend. So we ended up doing retreats for people who were interested in Medjugorje for the next, probably we did for the next 3 years. We did that, probably about 3 retreats per year. And then God changed plans completely. My sporting lease year was coming to an end. It was in that 10-year lease that went with the house. And the forestry weren't interested to enjoy it, taking everything back in hand. So we lost all that income and we had to change course. So we said, what are we going to do about it? We could either sell the place, and the kids were against that idea, or perhaps turn it back into an hotel with a pub, and that wasn't a very popular idea. So the third idea was, well, let's turn it into a house of prayer. No, everyone went quiet, you know. And we all prayed about it, and we said, right, we'll think about it. We'll pray about it for a year. And in that year, you know, we also prayed about it. I remember going out to Medjugorje, and I met Father Jozo, who was a wonderful priest, and a very holy priest. And the person who took me out, he couldn't speak English at all, but this driver who was an interpreter, he said, I will tell you what you want to do. And I said, well, I think you're turning our house into a house of prayer. And Father Jozo took my arms. He took me like, he said, oh, cast your bread on the waters, just like that, you know, get on with it. Don't hesitate, you know. It's really lovely, yeah. So all little things like that came about.
It took a lot of courage, because we had Mum and Dad Mum and Dad had already had 2 heart attacks, and Mum was very, very almost crippled with osteoarthritis, and then so she was in bed for the rest of her life virtually. And we had Mark still at school, who was just beginning to get a bit easier, but was still very difficult and still had a lot of schooling to go. And we had the teenagers as well. And the teenagers didn't find the transition from what we were going to do to suddenly finding Magnus had gone up to university. I didn't last long. He hated it and came out. But he was by far the cleverest. But he wrote to me in the end and he said, "If you make me stay here," he said, "I'll become an atheist or an alcoholic or both." He said. So I said, "You better come back." That's when he became a fish farmer. And then, of course, he went out, that was 92, went out to help with the 92 war in Bosnia and met Julia and started Mary's Meals. Darling, did you?
Hold on, little girl, show me what he's done to you. Stand up, little girl, a broken heart can't be that bad when it's through, it's through. Fate would twist of both of you. So come on, baby, come on over, let me be the one to show you. I'm the one who wants to be with you. Deep inside, I hope you'll feel it too. Feel it too. Waited on a line of waited on a line just to be the next to be with you. Build up your confidence so you can be on top for once. Wake up, who cares about little boys that talk too much? I've seen it all go down. The game of love was all rained down. So come on, baby, come on over. Let me be the one to hold you. I'm the one, yeah. Deep inside, I hope you'll feel it too. Feel it too. Waited on a line.
Yeah, that takes us really into the era of the prayer house, because we then decided that we would go full tilt. But it was a big decision because we had no money. Or we always went into the red in the winter when we had the prayer house. We just managed to keep ticking over for the summer months, and then we go into when we were doing the guest house. But in the wintertime, by after Christmas, we were in the red again. But the bank would see us through until we started again at Easter time, to suddenly decide that we would go from that into the prayer house, and we had absolutely no reason to believe that the prayer house would give us a penny. And we had this mythical idea that in Medjugorje, in those early days, they didn't ask you for money, you just gave them a donation. And we started with that lovely idea. It didn't work in Britain. Very few people gave, they all said they'd had a lovely time, but very few people gave you a donation. So we very, very quickly were going bankrupt.
3 more bottles. And
Carmen took I was explaining when you were away how we took a whole 5 busloads of young people out to Medjugorje at the stage for the second youth festival. Carmen went out for the first festival, then the second festival he decided we mounted a huge organised fund-giving thing.
About 200 young people.
Yes, out to Medjugorje and in buses, and I had to stay behind here, and because we had, I think it was called Catholic Families Association or something, were here. And so I was here doing that, and Callum would ring me, and I said to Callum, do ask them all to come back, when he told me how they were all responding to the graces out there, and there'd been wonderful miracles of grace given to these kids. So I said, invite them back, and that's when they started to come back here. But then, during that time when Callum was away, we realised that we didn't have enough money to pay the mortgage on the house, and there was nothing left in the bank at all, virtually. And so I said to Callum on the phone, you know, darling, there's nothing left in the bank, and they're asking us for the mortgage. And so that's when we decided to sell the river, because that was the only asset we could do without it, with what we were doing now. That actually turned out to be far more valuable than we'd ever dreamt it would be. And God didn't even allow us to put it on the market. The man who bought it eventually kept ringing us up and putting a bigger bid and a bigger bid and a bigger bid. And finally one day he rang up and he said, and I kept on saying to Callum, oh, just sell it, Callum, just sell it. You know, and he said, no, we'll just wait a little bit longer. And then the man rang up and said, this is the last time. I'm going abroad and that's it. And I said, As we rushed into Mum's bedroom, Dad had died by then. We said a rosary, said, pray, Mum, that we'll make our mind up whether this is the right thing to do or not. And at the end, I said, Callum, I'm sure God's saying, this is it. Just He's given us all that, that's it. And Callum said, we'll ring up our accountant. Who
But also a good salmon fisherman.
Yes, a good salmon fisherman. And the accountant said, you're mad not to sell it, sell it. We were still living in the lodge, but we were turning the lodge into the prayer house, and we'd got to the stage when we were going to make it into a charity. And because of that, eventually we had to get out. Us and all our children and our grandchildren had to be seen to be separate from the lodge legally. So that's why we'd never owned a house of our own. So the remnants of that money, after about 5 years, the money had just gone into keeping the lodge going. The little bit left, our son-in-law said, you must build this house.
Build a house before the money all gets used up on the prayer house.
That's why we
He's
built this
absolutely right.
house and moved in here. But the rest of the money all went into those difficult years when people didn't know who Craig Lodge was, you know. So it's always been a struggle for us financially, but God has never let us down. One story I'll tell you, which shows that God has always been there, was we had Penny and Stephen Roach. Do you remember them? No.
No.
They came and they were ex-community members, and they came. He was Australian, to look after. Said they'd look after the house, and we thought that's great. We'll retire. So we retired to this house just as it had been finished, and they took over. And about 2 years into that, they came and told us there was no money left in the bank, and they didn't have enough to get through the winter time. And I remember Callum and I saying, well, how much do you think we'll need? And they said, well, to get through the winter, we'll need £10,000. And I said, well, the only thing you can do is to go and ask the bank for £10,000, but I don't know if they'll give it to us. And we walked back, and as I walked back to this house, I said to Callum, well, that'll be the end of it. I've always said to God, you know, we'll do this for as long as we can do it, as far as the money keeps coming in, and you have to look after that, please. And as long as our health is good enough to keep going, we'll do that. And as long as people keep coming. And I said, looks as if the money's dried up, so God must have another plan. So we were quite sad about it, as you can imagine. And the next morning, a cheque for £10,000 came from an anonymous, it was in an envelope, in the post, the next morning. And it was from a bank manager in or somewhere. To this day, I couldn't tell you where it came from, who sent it, and we'd never told a single soul that we were in that plight. And that saw us through that really bad patch. God the Father will always look after you if you're faithful. If you're faithful to what He has asked you to do, and I'm sure that's true of everything we do in all our lives, I'll look after everything else. Just be faithful. You know, God, for us, it seems like an impossible mountain. To God, it's nothing if you just trust Him. If He wants it for you to do it, He will do it.
Financial challenges are obvious challenges. Also, parenting your children as they were growing up.
I know.
And you had all these big projects going on.
I know. Well, that was a
But
pact I
don't think
made.
it's trust. That's the most vital thing, is just trust and hand it over to God. And He'll look, everything will be looked after. And that'll give you a total peace of mind. If you're worried, if you're anxious about whatever it might be, when you analyze it, it really means you're not trusting in God.
Well,
you're not handing it over. That's absolutely true. To
Yeah.
get that ability to be able to hand it right over is a really difficult thing to do, but that is the vital thing. Only you can hand everything over will you receive that incredible peace. And again, it's the importance of prayer. I mean, a lot of people say, oh, you've given up so much to do this prayer house thing, you know. Yet in actual fact, you can say in reflection, I personally, I think both of us, I'm sure, is we've never had so much peace as we have had since we've embraced on this thing of prayer. And it's more than just peace, it's joy. You know, this inner joy, this constant joy all the time. It doesn't matter about the ups and downs underneath. There's a perpetual joy within one. It's no, because one's allowed God to live within one and obtain that peace. But it's only through handing everything over. The more you pray, the more you see God's work, God's hand in absolutely everything.
You know, when I look back on my life, I remember when Callum is spontaneous It's rather like, you know, will we take the twins or will we take the one boy when we were off the... He means, oh, green-eyed twins. Yeah, we'll have the twins. Twins are great. We'll have the twins. Without any thought.
He
You know.
sounds like someone I know.
This sounded rather nice.
And I said, just back on a minute, let's just pray about this, you know. I remember when we were debating about the prayer house, which we took quite a long time to discern whether, because my big worry was that we had two elderly parents needing attention. I was running up the whole house, and Mark was still a real big amount of work, and psychologically in every other way. And was it the right thing to do at that moment? So I wasn't so spontaneously saying yes. I said I need time to really think. And then Dad died in the interim. Dad never saw the prayer house, but Mum did. I remember when I finally made up my mind, I had this conversation with Our Lady, and I said to her very seriously, and I've suggested it to so many young couples, I said, you know, they say to me, how are all your children so good? How are they kept the faith and all the rest of it? And I said, well, it's not just me. I said, it's not just Callum either. I said, I made this pact with Our Lady, and I think everybody should give their children to Our Lady. And after all, they're not just our children, they're primarily her children before they're even my child. And I said, I've learned that even more so with the fact that I've 3 of my 5 are adopted children. They're not my blood relationship, but I've got just as much love for them in my heart as I have for my natural children. And I said, so how much more our Blessed Mother must love us as her children? And I told our Blessed Mother, I said, right, if you want us to do this, and that means bringing lots of other teenagers into our house and, as it were, adopting a lot of children into our lives, you've got to be a really special mother to my children, because there's going to be gaps in my time. I won't be able to do all that I would want to do with my children. But I know that if you want us to do that, you'll fill the gaps. And she has. She's done it a million times better than I could have ever done. And she still does. And she has made that promise real to me, because my children have got such a love of her and such a love of the faith. And right, we've taken them to Medjugorje, we've done things with them and we've prayed with them and all the rest of it. But I know that she has become so special to them because of, as it were, that real consecration to her. And I don't think she will ever let go of children that we as parents give to her. And to me, that's why our children have, thank God, kept the faith. I'm sure of it.
Mums that feel like they're not performing as they are, you know, in different ways,
exactly.
or
She's
struggling.
the best mother.
She is the mother.
Yeah.
We all have
Absolutely,
that.
absolutely.
We all have her.
Absolutely, yeah. And so we, as you say, we can all share our mother. You know, we've all got the same mother. Certainly in my own life, and when I look at the lives of other people as well, I think, and we all know, that God doesn't ask us to do anything that he doesn't give us the grace to be able to do it. So if it's genuinely from God, however difficult it is, he will actually give us the grace to do that. And I think in our case, Mark, personally, I think he prepared our hearts when we adopted all the kids, not just Mark, but the 3 boys that we adopted, that we can genuinely say we love every bit as much as we do Ruth and Magnus. He was preparing our hearts without us realizing at the time what we were going to be doing now, which was opening. I mean, I think we had 130 kids, that a lot of them were needing extra help, were kids that came to the Krizovich community, the original house community. So in other words, he gave us the grace to open our hearts to all sorts of young people. And I'm sure that was the grace he gave us because we took in those adopted children who were in need. And I think the case for Mark was certainly he taught us far more than we gave him as a family. He gave us far, far more than we gave him. And the graces that he gave us all was different, but one of the main ones was I think he made us open our hearts to children in need, and especially in Magnus's heart. I think I often think that he would never have been feeding over 2 million children a day if it wasn't for the fact that he had watched Mark and taken him in, which wasn't easy for any of us, but particularly for Magnus, taken him into his heart and was actually the most, I suppose, Mark loved him more than anybody else in the world. And I think that's what gave Magnus the grace to do what he's doing now. And I think that, and then he taught us also, all of us, but what he taught me was the power of suffering, that what he suffered in his little, well, it wasn't so short, he was 39 when he died, but he showed us how, however ghastly his life was and however every sort and kind of suffering that a human being could have, he in a way had suffered it, but he made good out of that. And people like Father Slavko was the priest who showed him how his suffering could be something incredibly precious for the world. And as a 7.5-year-old, he accepted that, and he grew into that as he grew older. That gave him more consolation, that teaching on suffering, than anything else that he heard during his life. So he could face his suffering knowing that it was of value. And that was the greatest gift that he could have been given, to realize that it just wasn't a waste. It was a gift that he could give to other people. And he certainly used his suffering for that.
A young boy, he was wonderful when he had to go to hospital several times a year for treatment. And a lot of it was very, very painful. But every time he said, I'm offering it up to all the grandchildren.
Yes. Or he'd
It's
come
really
and ask
wonderful,
me, is there somebody in the community that needs prayers?
Yeah.
Because I'm having this horrible thing done, and it's so much better if I have a particular person that I'm giving it up for.
I'll tell you a funny story. Glasgow used to come up, and they gave them ash, and they very, very strong ash. And they used to come up, and the mother was very, very devout. She knew every prayer and everything. And I took them up there one day. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I said, right, we'll say the Divine Mercy Chaplet. Youngest boy is about 4 or 5 years old. For the sake of his sorrowful passion, he's looking down over the cliff to look at the sheep and things down below, you know. And then later on, there was a big youth event. She went down to the tent, and they wanted someone to start the rosary in the afternoon. And mother of these boys said, look, we'll lead it. So she went through all her 4 or 5 children. Each one did a decade. And the last one to do it was the wee boy, who had been looking over the cliffs, you know, and he knew the words and everything. But at the end of it, it is so embarrassing. He said, blessed be God, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Parrot. Really? He said parrot. And everyone laughed in the tent, and the poor wee boy, and he blushed. He had such a strong accent, he thought, spurret. And he thought spurret was a parrot. That's true. And some of the kids came up a few years ago because they're grown up now. And they said, "Do you remember the story about the parrot, about the holy parrot?" So we try and say 3 verses a day. It's rather like meal times. It's really interesting. I often compare prayer to food.
How many minutes
If you develop a prayer thing, you have to come back. You actually need it, and you miss it if you don't get it. It's just like you miss your breakfast. You really feel it. Or whatever meal. So I think with the 3 verses a day, if we can manage to get it in.
It's a good wholesome diet of
Yeah,
spiritual food.
but if you miss one, you actually, of course, we haven't said our words. You're missing not saying it. It's actually a love of prayer. It's a need of prayer.
But we
It's
are,
really wonderful.
we are so blessed because we've got
So
the
blessed.
rhythm of prayer. Like, you know, that's where I think we're so blessed to have that rhythm of prayer going on in the lodge as well. So in the morning, we'll try and go to morning prayer, which is the morning prayer of the church and rosary. So we hopefully start the day like that. But we know that's going on. So we hopefully go to that, and then we've got the grace of having mass every day here as well. So and then there's evening prayer. We very rarely get to evening prayer, but there's evening prayer going on as well. And then we've got the grace of so many wonderful priests visiting, adoration. During morning prayer we have adoration, and then during the on a Monday we have adoration. We take adoration every take a slot each, so we have perpetual adoration during the day, and then on a Wednesday evening we have a charismatic prayer group in the evening on a Wednesday night, so the whole community will meet. Right, we're just finishing, Julia. We're just finishing.
The other thing I find very important is to use the saints as our intercessors. It's so important. We've got St. Joseph as one of our patrons, and St. Therese, and to call on them. And I really feel, especially with St. Joseph, that he really looks after the property, the land, and everything. And if there's any difficulty, one pray to him, you can actually feel that benefit, that he is interceding on our behalf. And coming on other things like guardian angels. I think I personally have developed a very close attachment to my guardian angel, and I have for quite a long time now. And he's more and more important in my life than ever. And I pray to him. I'll just give you a little example. Like regarding temptation of any kind at all, and you pray to a guardian angel to say, look, you are, and I tell God, remember, you've given me a guardian angel. What's he there for? He's there to guard our souls, to guard us from any harm at all. So daily, perhaps even several times a day, I will say this little prayer, might be of interest, and I just say this prayer, I need your protection. So I asked him to put his beautiful wings around me, to encompass me like a big tent. Then I say, zip up the sides, to make sure that no nasty, sneaky arrows get in, sinful arrows get in. And then make the material of this tent really strong so it nullifies the effect of even the strongest attacks. And then I ask him to put a vellum, a wall right around me to protect me from all occasions of sin. And then if God wishes me to go through some temptation, I asked him to raise up that wall really high to protect, to give me the strength to endure that temptation.
And Callum's greatest thing is going up the hill. Because Callum's going to be 90 in December, but he goes up the hill, the Stations of the Cross, and to the Cross, which is quite a climb. Until recently, he would be going up most days and down, but
Yes,
the last
prayer
few
on the hill
years-
to me is so important. But prayer of the body, the prayer of the body is walking. Anyone who walks, they tend to get fit. And whether they've been ill or not, walking is always a good thing. So to me, walking is the prayer of the body. And then the mental prayer, the spiritual prayer, the two things combine so well. So on the hill, one time on the hill, I just start praying in my own funny way. But it seems, I feel it's effective. But anyway, I just pray all the time. It might be 2 hours or not, it doesn't matter. When I'm on the hill, I'm praying all the time. But it's maybe a couple of rosaries thrown in or something, but it's just praying for different intentions, people's needs, everything else, anything that comes, peace in the world, Our Lady's intentions. Throw it in the mix, and it's brilliant. And you get it, come off the hill just filled with this terrific joy and
Oh,
peace.
it's wonderful, Callum. And hopefully we'll visit the hill.
Yeah.
How often would you climb on the hill?
I must tell you a lovely little story about it.
Darling, enough
No,
story.
this is important. Okay, you go.
Darling.
And there's this young girl in our school group about 3 years ago. She came here and she was in a really bad way. She was just in bits, poor thing. I think she was actually suicidal. She was only about 16 or 17 and had a really difficult life. But there was another girl who was watching them, taking them up to one of our leaders. And she was keeping an eye on this girl, and she went up the hill. And when they go up the hill, they each collect a little stone in the burn at the bottom of the hill, and they take it up the hill. And they put all their woes, all their things into that little stone, and they leave it at the foot of the cross, up at the top. So they all do that.
Yeah.
And this girl I was speaking about did the same thing. And then when they left the top of the hill, this girl, Veronica, was leading them. noticed the girl was just sobbing her heart out. So she went down to her and said, put her arm around her just to console her. Knowing what she'd been going, I think she'd been had an abortion possibly or something. But anyway, the girl said, no, everything's been lifted. Total joy. It was beautiful, you know, it happens all the time. Where the ground stops and it meets the sky.
The
Then-
ground stops and
Yeah.
it meets the
And the
sky.
sky comes down
Is
here.
it that dot over there?
Yeah, do you see it on the skyline? That's a
I
deer.
see
That's a
that
deer.
dot. Yeah.
And
Yeah,
I
I
know
can
because I
see
know
that
there's no
dot.
rock there.
Is that a deer?
That's a deer. That's a red deer.
The
Long,
red
long way
deer's
away.
red or orange?
What's that?
Are the red deers red or orange?
Red or orange? That's what they can be orange, but they're usually red, reddish brown. Depends on the time of year. In
Go
July
up
they're nice and
now.
red. By the winter time they get a darkish brown. By the spring they're sort of grey brown. Right, so this is the 11th, this is the 13th station. What happened here? Remember?
He gets taken down from the cross.
That's right. And laid in the arms of his mother. In this station, Lord, let us reflect on that fact. You choose to be laid in the arms of your mother. Is that not just suggesting that we too should all come to our Blessed Mother, take refuge in her? So we ask our Blessed Mother to put a mantle of protection and love around each one of us and keep us safe.